All right, so positive behavior supports is probably the thing that is most often lied about. It's an amazing, when it's done well and when it's done right, it is amazingly effective. But there are a lot of people who like to call what they're already doing and what they've been doing all along positive behavior when it really isn't. Positive behavioral supports takes an entirely different view of what's going on with the person and how do we figure out what's going on. What is it they're trying to accomplish? How can we help them get that need met? Instead of assuming that the need is wrong or bad or otherwise needing to be extinguished. That's one of the big differences at the outset. But there's a whole lot of other things I'm going to go through relatively quickly, especially since this could be an entire week of content just to do this. So if you will hang with me, and now I've got to try and figure out if I can get there we go. Okay, so one of the first problems we have is, have you ever heard your other right? You know, it's like somebody lifts their left hand and they go, no, the other right. And you go, oh, okay. Well, one of the problems that we have with behavior a lot of times is that we've actually given conflicting instructions to people and they don't know which set to actually follow. You know, how many people have been told, behave like an adult? And really what that means is sit down, shut up, and be like a kid. Be quiet and compliant, right? Most adults that I know are not quiet and compliant. You know, I mean, we make up our own rules, right? You know, we kind of like decide whether or not we're going to follow that speed limit. Well, that's a nice suggestion, but I don't think so. Right? How many of you have ever gotten a speeding ticket? Let's just start with that. Okay? So, how many of you still speed that got that speeding ticket? Did I make my point? You know, it's the reality is that we make up our own rules for when we think we need to do stuff and how we need to do stuff. And the idea behind being an adult means I'm a grown-up and I get to decide stuff. So, well, let's talk about what we know about people. What we know is that when we force people to live together, especially if they don't want to live together, that not only doesn't it not work, it tends to cause problems. And I'm going to just put another overlay on that. Can you imagine what would happen if you were suddenly going to have 5 or 6 other spouses, not different, in addition to the one you currently have? Okay? Now you're all going to live together, and you're never going to be upset with each other. And every 8 hours, a new set of in-laws is going to show up. And some of them you've never met before. And you're not going to know them on Monday, and on Tuesday they're giving you a bath. And they have their way of making the beds that they want you to do, and their way for folding the towels, and their way. See, the thing is that when we force people to be in close space, we should anticipate problems. Unless they have chosen to be there. And even then, you should expect problems. I'm thinking fraternity and sorority houses. I mean, those come to mind off the top. Disability-based grouping doesn't work. We've already talked about that. What we know is that we put people together and they learn from each other's disabilities. And they learn which one gets the most attention, and they learn how to do it, and all of those other kinds of things. Unfortunately, you know, it seems like human services have imitated the prison system in way too many ways. And you know, when you put a whole bunch of criminals together for a really long time, do you think that they're all talking about how they're going to be wonderful, productive, helpful citizens when they get out? Are they talking about their crimes and all the other stuff that they did? And are they being mean to each other? And are they continue? And it's a dysfunctional society, and somehow we thought that made sense, that we would take all these bad people and put them all together in one place. And I'm not calling people who have developmental disabilities bad. I'm saying that we have people who have been put together that didn't necessarily need or shouldn't be. We know that the bigger something is, the less likely it is to work. We know that the more we try and control and dominate people, we know that doesn't work. We know that people will rebel against what they perceive as unjust demands, no matter who it is. We will all rebel against what we perceive as unjust demands. So the more we try and control people, the more we should expect resistance. Does that make sense? And the less we pay attention to what somebody is telling us, the more we should expect a tension to exist between us. Because, would you take the other end of these, please? Okay, now let's assume that you really want these. Okay, and I'm not going to give them to you. Has that created a tension between us now? Yeah, and you know what? That's stress. Stress is tension, so is resistance. Because if I try and get you to do something you don't want to do, you're going to push back against me. And the point is that both of those things are stress. And when I create tension and when I create stress, no matter how I do it, what I'm also doing is decreasing the likelihood of compliance with requests for other behaviors, and I'm increasing the likelihood of non-compliance even with traditionally compliant behaviors. And so have some bubbles and enjoy. That way you won't be so stressed out when you leave. We know that health and safety is a concept that doesn't really work. Health and safety as it is made up. It's a construct that was designed at CMS, and the reality is that all those things that we thought were going to make people healthy and safe turned out to not work so well. We put a whole bunch of people together in one place. Hey, guess what? The abuse and neglect rates went up. We're going to put all these people together so that they're going to get the best medical care. And guess what happened? Not. They're going to put all these people together, and we're going to create this health and safety environment. We're going to limit how people can do things and when they can do them, and we're going to have all these regimens, and what we wound up with was a whole boatload of behavior problems. See, a lot of the things that we said we were going to do to keep people healthy and safe turned out to be the exact wrong things to do. So now when we talk about people being safe and healthy, I'm making real careful that we're separating those concepts. Does that make sense? Because it's safe and healthy within the context of being an adult that gets to make free choice unless they've been adjudicated incompetent by a judge, by a magistrate, whatever. Does that make sense? You with me? So informed choice is not the same thing. So safety and health within the context of all of the other civil rights that I have. And this really is a civil rights issue. We know that forced labor doesn't work, and we also know that when we try and get people to do things they don't like to do, they don't do it very well. Have you ever noticed? How many of you do not like balancing your checkbook? Does that mean the rest of you balance your checkbook? Or does it mean the rest of you go, what the hell does that mean? See, the thing is that we tend not to do the things that we don't do well, and we tend not to do well those things that we don't like, because we don't practice them. And so the harder we try and get somebody to try and do something that they don't like to do or they don't feel that they're good at, the more likely it is they're going to be embarrassed, and the more likely it is we're going to have tension and resistance as a result. We know that punishment doesn't work. We figured that out, at least at a scientific level. Now, I'm going to also give you the caveat that my children were never allowed to know this bullet point because they got punished. But punishing adults tends to result in recovery from punishment, which means they pull out the invisible 2x4 and they hit you when you are least likely to expect it, which is usually 4 o'clock on Friday afternoons. Anybody ever have that experience? You know what I'm talking about then. But the point is that punishment in and of itself actually winds up serving as a detriment to the relationship and long-term behavior change. We've got research that's shown, basically, if I'm the punisher of you, okay, when it comes time for something else to happen, you won't do it for me. You may do it for him or for her, but not for me. Even if it wasn't, you'd think, that she's afraid of me and so she'll comply. It actually turns out that's not true. What you'll do is pretend to comply for a very short period of time. And then when I'm not in the immediate vicinity, you stop. Do you understand the difference? How many of us have done that? The cop pulls out behind you when you're driving, and you suddenly are going, what the heck is the speed limit here? And then you go, oh, I'm great. I'm really glad it's 80 because I was going 83. And then you're really glad it wasn't 65. But you would have slowed down to get it to the right speed limit while they were watching, and as soon as they weren't watching. And it's the whole thing of when the cat's away, the mice will play. What do we know about people is we know that the more we isolate them from the real world, the more likely it is they're going to pick up aberrant behavior, bizarre, unusual, atypical behavior. We know that learned helplessness and dependency, oh, I can't do it. I don't know what I want. I don't want to do anything. I want to just, we know that is endemic. That happens a lot. And it's because we've trained people how to do it. We know that the more bored somebody is, the more likely it is that they're going to get in trouble. Well, duh. Grandma told us that, right? Idle hands were the devil's workshop. We were supposed to be doing something. And so what do? We make everybody sit and watch television for long periods of time. Well, that makes really good sense. I'm sure Medicaid will think that's a reimbursable activity. Not. We know that loneliness kills. We know, when we talk about the health and safety stuff, we know from the research that more people will die from loneliness than all the other diseases combined this year. Because if I've got two people who have exactly the same illness, and one person has a bunch of friends, and this person doesn't, you have a 50% greater chance of dying from that illness than he does. We know that loneliness, the research is there. We know that loneliness is the number one killer in our society. And yet, how many of us are teaching people who have developmental disabilities how to have friends with other people who aren't paid to be with them in the community? People who like them. That's the definition of a friend, is somebody who knows you well but likes you anyway. The spouse is somebody who knows you well, likes you anyway, and forgets all the bad stuff and keeps coming back for more. Well, you don't get to that part until you get to the other part. So, we've got to stop with the victory through self-deception. If you're going to say, he's going to learn how to cross the street independently 80% of the time on alternate Tuesdays when there's a full moon. Now, despite the fact that our measurement criteria is ridiculous, what about the 20% of the time that he doesn't cross the street independently? Right? Do you understand that we've got to stop setting things up so that we can win, but that the person loses in the process? And it frustrates their freedom, because we're never so dangerous as when we don't know what we don't know and we don't know it. That's the thing that makes all the difference. You're going to hear, I'll guarantee you, I haven't even talked with the other folks about what they're going to talk about today, but I'll guarantee you that knowing what you don't know and figuring that out and going through the discovery process with people in the employment process is one of the most important things you can do. Is getting to know that person in a different way, outside of the context of the system and who they are. Does this bikini make me look fat? Well, I'm going to tell you that when you ask the wrong question, you will always get the wrong answer. There is no right answer to that question. The right question, however, is, what the heck are you doing wearing a bikini? So we've got to change the questions that we're asking so that we can get better information. Because if you ask the wrong question, you will always get the wrong answer, because it doesn't help you. Traditional behavior management has artificial thinking. It is, I can control someone else. I can make them do what I want them to do, even when I'm not there. How many of you are parents? How many of you have parents? Okay, now here it works on either side. Were your parents able to make you do what they wanted you to do? No. For those of you who are parents, were you able to make your kids do what you wanted them to do? No. How many of you had somebody in your life, parent, person, at some point in your life say to you, do not drink too much? Right? You heard that from somebody. Do not drink too much. Or do not drink. How many of you had to puke on your shoes a few times? Figure out how much that amount was. That's called discovery. It's also called non-compliance. But the point is that traditional behavior management begins with artificial thinking. And then what we do is we set up artificial environments and conditions to reinforce our artificial thinking. So we're going to have the behavior plan, and it's going to have the reinforcers, and we're going to have suddenly all of our staff, most of whom have changed jobs in the last 6 months, are suddenly all going to be 100% compliant with a plan that they don't understand. And they're going to implement it exactly the way the behavior analyst intended it for it to be written, or to be implemented. But we got to set up all those environments, and we have to set up the conditions to reinforce those, the conditions that are necessary to reinforce those environments. Because that's what we do. And then we set up the rules for how we're going to implement the conditions that support the environments, because we got to have rules, right? How we're going to do it. So it's exactly how we're going to make sure that we have our artificial rules that support our artificial conditions, that support our artificial environments, that support our artificial thinking. And then we create those interventions, because without the interventions, without the consequences attached to those rules, they're never going to do it, are they? We got to have the interventions to support the rules, to support the conditions, to support the environments. So we've got the consequences to follow the interventions, and the problem is that all winds up with artificial behavior. We wind up with the same kind of aberrant behaviors that you might see in a prison or other environment. And because people will resist, or it will create a tension, but in either case it's a stress, and as my stress levels go up, my disinhibition goes down. That means I'm more likely to do stupid stuff. How many of you have ever been really, really stressed, and you found yourself yelling at a person who had nothing to do with creating that stress? You know what I'm talking about, right? And then it's like, as you're yelling, you're going, it's not her fault, but I'm yelling and I don't know how to stop. Does that make sense? Okay? That's that disinhibition. That's the fight that's going on with the little neurotransmitters inside the brain that's saying, I have to get relief from this pressure, this tension, this stress that I'm experiencing. And it's often directed inappropriately because the person I wanted to say, I don't like you, I don't like your rules, and I don't want to do what you told me to do, has too much power over me or too much influence over what happens to me. And so I can't say it to her, but I can say it to somebody else. Okay? And so it leaks out. So, and I know that you're not really that kind of person, so I decided you deserved a magic wand. Remember, just wave it and all your problems go away. So here's the sign that says, hitchhikers may be escaping inmates. This is on US 24, in between the Ohio border and Ann Arbor, Michigan, a little past Ann Arbor. It's in that general area, but when I lived in Ohio, we used to vacation in the Upper Peninsula, which is the part of Michigan that they stole from Wisconsin when Ohio stole part of Michigan, and they had to end the war. You didn't know that, did you? Isn't that exciting? It was called the Cabbage Wars. But we used to go to the Upper Peninsula and we would stay really late. We'd stay as late as we possibly could because we wanted to squeeze out every ounce of vacation. And we had the kids, and we had one of those conversion vans. Remember them? Had, and you could turn the back end into a bed and you could hook up the TV and play the VCR, and the kids would be back there and they'd be falling asleep, mostly from the Benadryl that you'd given them. But when we would see the sign, we would always make a joke. Oh, look, there's our sign. We're almost home. We're only an hour away now. And after 5 hours with, 3 little kids in the van, that's a good thing to almost be home, because it means you probably won't go to prison. So we'd see the sign, and the one year, it's about 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, we see the sign, and we do the typical laughing, look, there's our sign. And immediately as we passed it, somebody shot at the van. And I don't mean kind of sort of shot at the van. I mean like from the side of the road, and it resounded, it echoed through the van. The gunshot did. And being the brave husband and father that I am, I immediately accelerated. And I've now got this conversion van, Chevy conversion van, going as fast as I possibly can get it to go. And unfortunately, the sheriff had been alerted to the fact that there had been a jailbreak. And so they had the helicopter out looking for this person. And since we were the only car on the road at 11:30 at night, and we were going 110 miles an hour, it must be us. And the problem is that now the searchlight from overhead is like blinding us in the eyes episodically, and the sound of the helicopter is so loud it's like deafening inside the van. It's really, really loud. And I don't want to stop because there's a guy with a gun there, but I also don't want to go too far to upset the law enforcement folks any more than they already are. So I find this little off-ramp, and I just go there as fast as I can, and I slam on the brakes, and I throw it into park, not quite stopped yet, so you know the wonderful sound that you hear. Comes to a stop, and I open the door, and I jump out, and I throw my arms out, surrendering to the law enforcement people. And there ain't nobody there. Some weird smells, but me and the crickets and my wife going, what's going on? What's going on? What's going on? And I'm going, I don't know. I'm really hoping this is not a flashback. It's going to make the rest of the drive really hard. And that's when I'm looking around and I realize that the driver's rear tire has blown out, which was the sound of the gunshot that reverberated inside the car. Now, unfortunately, it also managed to make a piece of the tread kind of come off when it blew, and so it was hitting the bottom side of the wheel well, and we were going 110 miles an hour. I'm telling you, that sounds like a helicopter. Do you understand that when you're doing that, it sounds like you are in serious trouble? And because my van was riding on that funky angle, My high beam lights were bouncing off of the overhead signs on the bypasses, on the overpasses, coming back into the van and making it look like it was a searchlight. Now, my children love to tell that story, even though they're all too young to actually remember it. And it's amazing how every Father's Day it gets a little longer. But the point to all of it is that unfortunately many of our behavior plans and interventions are based on signs that other people wrote. And sometimes we spend a long time making fun of it or ignoring it or not understanding the consequences of it, even though there was evidence that maybe something needed to be done. And so then when something finally happens, we have a tendency to overreact. Our brains make it into something other than what it really is, rather than sitting down and doing an honest evaluation. So good positive behavior supports takes a look at what the signs are, but doesn't necessarily assign a judgment to it. And says, let's figure out what it really means. What are they really trying to accomplish? And how can we help them accomplish what is legitimate, what is normative, what is typical, whatever language you want to use, in ways that aren't going to cause problems for other people and aren't going to be exaggerations. So quickly, positive behavior supports is quickly being identified and accepted as best practice. And it's the only legitimate option that's being acknowledged. It's the United Nations stuff, the Department of Justice. You've got court rulings all over the country. You've got some pending federal legislation. You've got the school acts. You've got all these things that are saying positive behavior supports is what you're supposed to do. Now the problem is going to be, how do you demonstrate that that is actually what's being done and not just somebody doing the same thing they've always done and calling it positive behavior supports? Because there's a lot of people out there trying to sell their training systems and they're calling it positive behavior supports when it's really not. It's positive behavior supports light, or it's kind of sort of like positive behavior supports, but it's not exactly. Now we're going to see CMS standards already, that they're going to continue to get tighter in the expectation of mental health care and positive behavior supports. So your funders are changing their way of looking at it as well. And we're looking at the elimination of aversives and restraints of all kinds, except in an immediate, unplanned emergency. And, obviously, if somebody's running out in front of a car, you want to grab them and hold them so that they don't get hit by the car. But it's not something you write into somebody's plan. That's going away, and it's going away quickly. So let's talk about what wraparound means. Basically, it means that you are focused on the relationships and the arrangements and trying to figure out what it is that the individual needs and provide that, not anything more, not anything less. And that you're thinking it in terms of what is functional for the individual instead of what have we always done. The reality is that we've got a whole lot of people that are in shoe tying programs, and I'm using that as a euphemism, when there are sandals and flip-flops and Velcro and loafers, and we don't need to know how to tie shoes. Stop teaching shoe tying. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, I know that there are still people being taught how to cook on a stove, and they can't move out of their 16-bed group home until they learn how to cook on a stove. I don't cook on a stove. I cook in a microwave. I ain't got the time for a stove. You can find almost anything in the grocery store microwavable. Right? And it's like, edamame, microwave. Oh, Japanese, oh, thank you very much. Oh, good dinner. If I had to know all the things I was supposed to know about women and intimate relationships and sex and all of that stuff before I was allowed to have one of them, I would still be a virgin. because I still got stuff I'm going, I don't get it. I just don't get it. There's some stuff you're never going to get. You don't need to get all of it. There are ways to compensate. I do not know how to balance a checking account. I can do a multi-million-dollar agency budget. Can't do checking account. My wife does checking account. She's an RN, rigid and neurotic. She's the person who gets excited when the statement comes in the mail, even though she can look at it online, because she's got the real one. And she will sit down and she'll get her calculator out, and she's got the black and the red pen, and she's got the ledger sheets, and she's doing it all, and she's recording it. And like 2 hours later, I'll go, what the hell is taking so long? She said, we're off by 25 cents. I said, here's $1. We're covered for a month. No, that's not how it works. But you know what? I'm really grateful that she's in my life, because if it was me, I would be in serious trouble, because I think if the bank has sent me checks, I still have money. It's like you find out you're overdrawn at the grocery store when they go, I'm sorry, sir, we have to cut this up. So she takes care of that for me. But see, that's wraparound services. Does that make sense? That's thinking differently about what we can't do. And instead of limiting me from having relationships because I don't know how to do my checking account, I found somebody who wanted to do the checking account and has really poor eyesight. So she doesn't realize what I look like. It works out really well. But good wraparound means planning and intentionality, that this is not about just crisis services and throw people and bodies at it. It's not about making the wall of flesh instead of the wall of bricks. It's about how we're going to do it in reasonable and intelligent ways, and having the flexibility of the resources available to be able to do those things. And that it's available when it's needed, and hopefully before it's needed, because the best thing you can do for a crisis is to prevent it from happening in the first place. So paying attention to those kinds of things. So it's available in duration and frequency and intensity. And it also means that we are going to embrace creativity in how these services are defined and utilized, so that they're truly for the benefit of the individual rather than for the system. Because systems can't care. Only the people within those systems can care. And I don't know about you, but that seems like it's really smart to me. It's different, it's weird, it's atypical, it's not normal, but it's working. So if it's working, why are we got to screw with it and say, I'm sorry, but that's an unlicensed hot dog cooker? We must have a license for all hot dog cookers, and our hot dog cookers do not allow for more than 3 prongs. Do you understand that you're kind of like, why is it we keep doing that to ourselves? We find something that works, and then we make some kind of stupid limitation on it that makes it hard for us to do good stuff. We got to talk about the body human briefly, and that is trauma-informed supports. And if we are now learning so much as I hate to admit this, we are learning so much about how the brain works because of the vets who are coming home now, because of the PTSD, because of the concussive injuries that have happened, because people who used to die in war are not dying, they're surviving, and they're coming home, and we're seeing the effects of the trauma. So we're going to have to start having trauma-informed support. And we know this from research of children who have been abused. We know it from the research about adults who've experienced horrendously traumatic events. It literally causes rewiring of the brain. Positive behavior supports takes a look at all of those kinds of things, because physiology is real, whether you like it or not. Epinephrine and norepinephrine and acetylcholine are real things. serotonin is a real thing, and it affects our behavior. And until we're willing to accept that our behavior may not be something we can control or modify, then we're going to continue to have problems. If you're diabetic, are there things you can do to help make the diabetes more manageable? Yes. Are they going to cure the diabetes? No. And you don't take the insulin away from somebody because they hit a stable level. You modulate it so that it maintains. Does that make sense? So, positive behavior supports is not anti-medication when it is designed for the syndrome of what is going on rather than the symptoms, because we're not going to keep treating just symptoms. Does that make sense? You with me? Okay. So we've got to pay attention to the amygdala and how that affects our brains. And how many of you have ever seen somebody who's come out of an institution and they've got institutional eating behavior? You know what I'm talking about, right? Cover, hover, shovel. And they go as fast as they can. Why did they have to do that? Why did they have to do that? Somebody's going to steal their food. Yes. No, I don't want to throw these, because they'll break and then they won't be any good for the rave later tonight. Yeah, the staff were going to tell them that they'd taken too long to eat. Somebody was going to steal it. Somebody was going to turn it into a Frisbee, whatever. And when you are in survival mode, you do what you have to do to survive. And it means cover, hover, shovel. And that means that even 10, 20 years later, your brain is still going, you got to do this, even if nobody's touched your food in 20 years. Even if you had free access to the food. And putting your fork down in between each bite is the stupidest thing you can possibly do, because it increases the anxiety of the person who's sitting at the table. And then what we know is that as we increase the anxiety, we increase the stress, and we increase the likelihood of misbehavior. So we accept that when we learn something in survival mode, that if you really have been raped and somebody comes up from behind you and you turn around and you start swinging as hard as you can, you learn that in survival mode. That's not going away quick, ladies and gentlemen. What that means is that we learn how to help them feel safe. And it means that we tell other people, you don't approach Sarah from behind, ever. And if you have to approach her from behind, you're going, hey Sarah, how are you? So she will turn around and look at you and see who it is. Do you understand? That's positive behavioral supports. And that's a major difference. Rather than trying to make somebody do something that is going to feel incredibly unnatural. But that's not going to happen fast. And it's not going to happen typically. And you're going to have to teach. And you're going to have a lot of staff training. And you're going to have people who really are qualified to teach, not people who think they're qualified to teach. And there are a lot of self-proclaimed experts. And I'm sorry, Wyoming has a few of them. I go to the national conferences, and I'm going to tell you, be careful of people who say they are the expert on dual diagnosis. They are the expert on mental health. They are the expert on behavioral interventions. Because you evaluate their expertise on the basis of outcomes, not on self-report. So just please be careful. And I'll just leave it at that. So we know that the more positive experiences that we can put into the brain, the more likely it is that that brain's going to recover from those trauma experiences. The problem is that those vets that are coming home that have those PTSD events, guess what? Things aren't going so well with the family. Is that a positive experience? They're not getting to spend time with the kids that they've been missing the whole time they were serving. Is that a positive experience? They can't get the job back that they had before they left because, oh, that went to somebody else, and, oh, you know what, we're not really sure we want you here in the first place because you still look crazy as hell. That's not a positive experience. And guess what? My wife is looking at me like I'm a stranger. That's not a positive experience. Now, I just used vets as an example. But you know what? You can draw immediate and direct parallels to people who have developmental disabilities. And you don't even have to be smart to do it. But until we create experiences that people who have the disabilities say are positive, are good, are fun, are happy-making, whatever you want to call it, those brains are not going to recover from the traumas. It's only when we redesign, we create new neural pathways. We create a new groove, literally, electrical groove in the brain. That's what they start paying attention to, and it stops going to the trauma groove. When I was a little kid, my dad brought home all kinds of things for me to take apart, and I really loved that. I love taking things apart. I love to learn like that. And I took his adding machine apart one time. Remember adding machines? And they had like 9 million buttons on them, and you could push them in. And I made a robot, and that was his chest. He was a wooden robot. I nailed 2 galvanized nails into the back of him. I took the cord from the adding machine, and I tied it onto the galvanized nails, and I took it upstairs, and I showed my mom my robot, and I plugged it in. And it didn't move the way I had envisioned it moving. And so I said, I don't know what's wrong. I wonder if it's these nails. And I grabbed a hold of the nails. And that was when we proved that an 8-year-old and a robot made of wood could both fly in opposite directions. My mom could have made that a horribly awful, negative, traumatic event. Or she could have allowed the natural and logical consequences to sink in. And that was the day I learned how to plaster a wall. I also found out that when you have galvanized nails in your fingers, it burns them into nice little arcs. And they will be with you for forever. But the point is that it didn't require another consequence. Does that make sense? That's positive behavioral supports. Because historically what we do is we look at the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence. And then we say, okay, we're going to develop a plan to change the behavior, and so we write the plan, and the problem is that while we're busy writing the plan, the behavior happens another time. And, of course, we designed the consequence on the basis of the strength of it being at the old level, but now it's, in this example, twice as strong as it used to be. Does that make sense? So now I'm looking at the new baseline, and we know that there's such a thing as a behavioral spike anytime I make a change. How many of you have ever tried to lose weight and you found out that you in fact gained weight? You are like 95% of the rest of the people who have tried to lose weight. You will gain weight. It's a behavioral spike. So we try and get them to engage in this. We get a behavioral spike, and lo and behold, we wind up with the behavior now 3 times as strong as it was, but we created a bigger consequence, but it was still only designed to be able to address the old level. And so now and you know what? We quickly get to the place where it's unethical, immoral, or unjustifiable for us to go any further with the consequence side of this. Because it'll be illegal at the very least. Does that make sense? But that's the way we historically have done things. And what I'm suggesting that we do instead is change the antecedent from the outset. Create a different set of circumstances at the beginning. That's a key element to positive behavior supports. It's a key element to people being successful in their lives in general, is you change the antecedent, because when you tell me I'm going to McDonald's, I have a very different response than when you ask me what my favorite restaurant is and do I want to go there. You with me? Change the antecedent. Then you will have a different behavior, and the consequence can be natural and logical, and you don't have to spend the time or the energy or the money on trying to create a consequence that is going to somehow meet all of these needs. And it's doing it again. There we go. So how I think affects how I feel, and thus how I behave. How I feel affects how I think, and thus how I behave. And how I behave affects how I think and how I feel. Does that make sense? And then it affects the way I behave. Now, if thinking doesn't work so good for people, and they've got a bunch of messed up experiences, then what we're going to have to do is give them new behaviors, new experiences to help them reset the brain. Does that make sense? You with me? How many of the women in this room at one time or another heard from mom or the mom type person, I don't want you to see him anymore. Don't want you to go out with him. Okay? What happened to his value as soon as she said that? You went, of course, Mom, I'll never see him again. He's out of my mind. Or, what happened? Oh, you wanted to do it more. Oh my goodness. Bad girls after my heart. So, how you think is affected by how you feel because you loved them. So when Mom said don't, you said, I think Mom's crazy. Of course I'm going to, and that affected my behavior. And once you get into a pattern of doing things, that's what feels like normal. Does that make sense? So if you're doing stuff and it feels like normal, if your behavior is aberrant in its nature from the very beginning because you're living in a disability bubble or because you've got some kind of strange rules around you that nobody else in the real world ever has to live under, or any of those other kinds, you got some really mean staff or whatever, that can affect how you think and feel and therefore how you behave. So here's one of my favorite slides. Sometimes I feel like I have the worst job in the world. Yeah, right. Yeah. It's not until you take their position that you understand it. It's not about looking at deficits and needs. It's looking at what do we like to do. Can we do it? Do we have the opportunities? Can we get away with not doing things that we don't do so well? A picture of my son Colin, who's now 30 years old, got married at the end of April. I love humiliating him. No, but this is actually more about Daddy, because I was at the Institute for Applied Behavior Analysis when this occurred. And I'm on the phone. This is back when there was only such a thing as corded phones. You remember that, right? Somebody tell me, please. Okay, good, thank you. But I was stuck on the call, and he had this habit of eating the dog food, and I couldn't get to him and stay on the call. So I've covered the mouthpiece, and I go, Laura, he's eating the dog food again. I did not think that the appropriate response to that was to bring the camera. Do you understand where I might look at that and go, how is this helping? And she just said, oh, it doesn't help. It's just cute. Oh, okay. I'll go back to my call. I told you I still don't get some things. So anyway, she said to me at one point, because I had this differential reinforcement of other behavior, schedule, plan thing all worked out so that when he ate dog food, I was going to do this other thing and I was going to do this reinforcer. And it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work, and it didn't work. And she finally said to me, are you done trying to therapize our son? And I said, yeah, okay, what, you got something better? And she said, yeah, I do. I think that it might work. And I said, okay, go for it. And so she took a bowl and she poured Fruit Loops in it, and she moved it in and put it beside his toy chest, picked him up, dropped him off in front of the bowl at his toy chest, and he bent over and started eating the Fruit Loops. He left the dog food alone, as long as there was Fruit Loops. And then we got him shifted over to something a little healthier, Cheerios or whatever, slowly. And he turned out okay. I mean, he still carries milk bones, but other than that, he's a relatively normal kid. But again, it goes back to the issue of common sense and doing things that make sense for the right reason. Here's a whole bunch of stuff about understanding human behavior, and if you don't understand that these are things that matter to us, then you're not going to understand how to help people who have disabilities. And you're in the wrong place. And the importance of what motivates you, what you are passionate about, what you're interested in cannot be overstated. Because sometimes you got to fake it till you make it. You know what I mean? It's like you got to practice it until you can get to the place. So we've got to look at the fundamental nature of relationships and all those kinds of things. And there are new assessments that look at motivation, tension, and resistance, which we happen to develop and we don't charge for. It's on our website. The instructions are there. The assessment is there. It's free. If you download the electronic Excel sheet, it automatically does all the math for you, and it tells you these are the things that this person is interested in. And that's the courtesy of Dr. Stephen Reese, who allows us to use his material, and Dr. Susan Haverkamp, who co-wrote the stuff on motivation. But I was literally riding on a bus in Haifa with Stephen Reese when he told me that he had done this new thing on motivations and what he had found about how it affects people with developmental disabilities. And I said, oh my gosh, we got to have an assessment that helps figure that out. And he says, well, go for it. So thank you, Dr. Stephen Reese. I want to make sure he gets credit. But I also want to make sure that we leave today understanding that this is not the fault of the children. The children are a necessary element of this situation, but they are not sufficient. It's only leaving the paint where the children could get to it and inappropriate supervision that made this possible. So I wonder who is really to blame for the way things turned out here. We've got to pay attention to getting good information out of our assessments, not the old stuff. I'm sorry, the ICAP is old stuff. Seriously, why are we still using something that is 40 years old when we know that there's stuff that makes much more sense? We've got to stop doing things that don't make sense and stop spending time and energy and money on those things. So I'm sorry if I've offended somebody who loves the ICAP or who just bought 9,000 of them. But the problem is that tension and resistance create stress and distrust, and anytime we have that, there's a picture of the assessment real quickly. But anytime that you've got the colors, that tells you where your problems are going to happen. So you want to pay attention to, obviously, the things that are stupid. You don't want to encourage people to do things that are inherently dangerous. And you want to try and remember that when you create stress, you will create regression in behavior, and then you will have a spike. You will have new behaviors. Let's take a look at the things that cause stress in people's lives, and how can we get rid of these? How can we spend time teaching skills that really matter to people instead of how to make their bed or how to make hamburger helper for 8? It's not what not to do is just as important as what to do. Don't try and turn the beaver into a duck or the duck into a beaver. Neither was meant to be the other, just because they like water. So apparently I've said something to upset you. I just don't know what it is yet. But the point is that it's not until we have the conversations with the people as best we are able who are experiencing the pain and the confusion and the stress and the frustrations. We've got to get rid of our attitudes that cause the problems in the first place. We've got to find a way for even mistakes in behavior to be a learning experience. And we've got to figure out how we're going to have the right mind, the right motivation, and the right motion by providing the right model, the right memory, and the right mentor. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to spend some time with you today. God bless.